Hello, Quiet Rioters. It's me, Naomi. And this week, for Poll the Other One, I spoke to polling guru Peter Kellner about what he calls the Brexit fallacy of Labour's Red Wall victory. Peter posits, got to say that a few times, Peter posits that it wasn't being anti-Brexit that cost Labour the 2019 general election, but other factors, including economic decline of previously industrialised areas, and that Jeremy Corbyn as leader was unpalatable to those kinds of Red Wall voters. But being a data cruncher, he wanted numbers to back it up. And that is not quite as straightforward as it might usually be, because constituency boundaries were redrawn between the 2019 and 2024 general elections. So Peter merged the notional results of the 2019 election mapped onto 2024 boundaries with House of Commons data on the percentage votes for each party in each seat in July. This means he could analyse the 31 Red Wall seats in the North and Midlands that Labour lost to the Conservatives in 2019 and regained this year in order to calculate how much their vote went up in each seat. And the answer is they didn't go up, they fell. At the July election, Labour's Red Wall popularity slumped to its lowest for at least 40 years and possibly far longer. Peter thinks that their extremely cautious approach on Brexit may not have helped them at all in the Red Wall and could even have hindered them. He's concerned that this Brexit fallacy is driving anti-European orthodoxy, particularly when it comes to the Treasury. I was desperate to pick his brain on it all a bit further, and our conversation was both detailed and wide-ranging. We even got on to what to do about the farmers. So I hope you enjoyed this week's Poll the Other One. Let us know. I'll be back at the end with a little wrap-up. But for now, sit back and enjoy Poll the Other One with Peter Kellner. Welcome, Peter. Thank you for making your debut on Quiet Riot.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Naomi. I'm honoured to be asked.
Oh, well, we're very honoured to have you. I really wanted to get into your latest Substack, and listeners, there'll be a link to Peter's Substack for you to subscribe to in the show notes. But Peter, you talk about the myth of Labour's victory 4 months ago. Can you just tell us what you mean by that phrase?
It's something that's been available if you knew where to look for the data ever since the election. But I was prompted, I won't name her, but a friendly Labour, pro-European Labour MP, who said, look, what actually happened in the Red Wall? So I actually looked at the votes. It's not that easy because most of the information, if you go into the House of Commons library, which does a wonderful service on these kinds of occasions, what you get is a lot of percentage figures of percentage change. And I wanted to look at the actual votes. How many people voted Labour in the key Red Wall seats in 2019, and how many people voted Labour in those same seats this time, allowing for boundary changes. What I found, I looked at 31 seats in the Midlands and North that the Conservatives had gained in 2019 and Labour regained in 2024 this year.
So you'd think, okay, they're doing better there then, they won them.
But what I found was that it was not because Labour's vote went up. I'll give you the average figures. In 2019, the average Labour vote in these seats was just a little under 18,000. This time, this year, in the same seats, the average Labour vote was just under 17,000. It fell by nearly 800 when you take into account rounding. So the Labour vote didn't go up at all in numbers. Now, turnout, of course, across the country was down a bit. So Labour's percentage share did go up because the turnout was down. It only went up, though, by just over 3 percentage points, which is not great, remembering how badly Labour did in 2019. So given that Labour's defence of its election strategy, in particular, trying to say nothing dramatic about Europe, to accept the fundamentals of the Brexit settlement, to say we're not going back into the customs union or the single market, no free movement, hardline on all these things, was to get back the pro-Brexit votes that Labour lost in 2019. And therefore, it was clear that the basis of Labour's ambition was to increase Labour's votes. If he's going to win back these votes, in these Brexit votes in the red wall seats, success would be, at the very minimum, Labour's votes going up. It didn't go up, it went down. I was surprised to find this. I thought it was quite remarkable. And I thought, this is worth doing a post on. And indeed, although I'm fairly new to Substack, it has been read by twice as many people as my earlier Substacks.
Oh, fantastic. And even more after this show, no doubt. Thank you for going into the numbers, because this is part of our Poll the Other One series. And the people that tune into this particular show are the polling junkies like me. And we just can't get enough of this stuff. Just to reaffirm, your concern about this sort of Brexit fallacy, this myth of Labour's victory, is that they may take comfort from having won back many of these red wall seats by not pursuing a pro-European or overtly pro-European campaign strategy, but that is actually quite possibly incorrect.
That's right. An obvious question is, okay, if Labour's vote went down, how on earth did it gain all this? Is? And the reason was the Tory vote halved, most of the lost Tory votes going to reform. In other words, it was a split on the right. So the average Tory vote fell from 22,000 to 10,000. So 22,000 beat 18,000 in round figures, what was happening in the typical red wall seat in 2019. But this time, Labour's vote fell to 17,000, but the Tory vote fell to 10,000. So Labour wins. But it was reform taking votes off the Tories. That was the key fact. Why do these numbers still matter? And this is where we relate the election figures to the politics. Labour's big ambition is to be the fastest growing economy of the G7 countries. Well, it is now, I think, pretty well accepted. The Office of Budget Responsibility confirmed this in its report from the recent budget. The Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, said it, I think just the other day. Brexit has damaged Britain's economy, and it's damaged it a lot. If Britain is to get back to growth, one of the most obvious things to do is to restore frictionless trade across the channel between Britain and the European mainland. And that means something like the single market, something like the customs union, something around a free movement, if not for everybody, at least for people who come to Britain to work.
It certainly feels like the budget was like your main motivator to do this work. You
Yeah,
say that an unnamed Labour MP also gave you a nudge, but you talk about, Reeves finding herself caught between the economic case, which you've
yeah.
just touched on, for this much closer trading relationship with Europe, and the political reality, in quotes, of that being unpalatable to voters. But we now know from polling that that is a fallacy, that actually public opinion on Europe is very different to what it was in 2016 and perhaps even 2019. So surely Labour strategists know that too. What is really going on, do you think?
This is a very good question. This is why I ended my Substack with a sort of irony, saying, will Rachel Reeves now have to have the courage to do something popular, given that she's made a habit since the election of saying tough decisions, don't take tough decisions. I think what's going on is that there is still a belief around Keir Starmer, and I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect he's getting the same kind of polling advice or focus group advice he was getting before the election, saying that Labour must, under those circumstances, frighten off the people who came back to Labour because of Brexit. Well, people didn't come back to Labour because of Brexit. And incidentally, it's not just, as you rightly say, but by a big margin, people now think Brexit was a bad
Yes,
idea.
what is the latest public opinion on Europe?
It's now, I think, been pretty stable for the last year or 18 months, that somewhere in the mid-50s percentage points say we were wrong to vote to leave the EU, and the mid-30s, somewhere in the region of 35%, say it was a right decision. So there's something like a 20-point. It oscillates a bit from poll to poll, but it's reasonably settled the big picture. And what this means is, when you burrow into the figures, pretty well everybody who voted Remain still holds the view that we should be in the EU, but a minority, but a significant minority of Leave voters now think it was a mistake. And when you dig into some of the issues, I've done some of the polling, various companies have done it, and it's all pretty consistent. UK and Changing Europe has done quite a lot on this. And what they all find is that people would quite like the idea of getting back into the kind of trading relationship we had with the customs union and the single market. And also, I found, and again, this is consistent over recent years, that while people are wary of immigration in principle, when you ask either about Europeans who come here to work as opposed to come here for some other reason, they're comfortable with that. And when you ask about particular kinds of jobs in hospitals, in care homes, in restaurants, in hospitality, and all that, and you say, do you think we should allow in more of these people or fewer of these people than we do now? Only a small minority say fewer people. So there's the difference between the abstract idea of immigration and some of the cliches and myths around what that is. And when you start saying, when you bring it down, there's a horrible word called, I think it's individualization or something like that, where and it's true on many issues that people say one thing about the big issue in general terms, but when you get down to the
Mm.
specifics, they want fewer people coming from, I know, the subcontinent, but do they want to lose their local Indian or Chinese takeaway? No, they don't. Do you know what I mean? So
Reminds me of, was it Rowan Atkinson did that character where he said, "And now we've got the recipe, they could all go home again." And he was sort of
yes,
hamming up this sort of archetypal,
yeah,
xenophobe. It's clear. You've laid it out very, very clearly. The country is much more pro-immigration once you start asking them about
yeah,
specific types of migrants in the country. They are very pro being able to emigrate too. And we know that
yeah,
support for,
yeah,
things like a reciprocal youth mobility scheme and touring visas for our wonderful artists are hugely popular too. And international students coming here, etc., is all very palatable to even Leave voters. Getting back to this issue for Rachel Reeves in particular, when we look to America, I mean, voters feeling the pain of the cost of living crisis rejected the incumbent party. And surely that's Labour's biggest risk, not delivering growth. But I would put to you that even if they do pull the trade lever with the EU, negotiations take time, particularly negotiations with the EU. And so any effects may well be very unlikely to be felt in time for the next election. Isn't that part of her rationale for not going heavy on that in the budget?
this is a fair point. The negotiations will be difficult, and of course, the EU won't want to go back to the sort of status quo ante from 2016. They will make their own demands about what they want from Britain, about fishing quotas off in the North Sea, which some British fishermen won't like, and so on. No, it could be detailed, it could be messy. But what we've got now is we've got the certainty that Britain is trying to restore growth with one arm tied behind its back because of what Brexit has done, and the possibility of making changes that will help Britain in the long term. Now, I agree absolutely that the fruits of growth are unlikely to be felt by the time of the next election. And of course, one of Kamala Harris's problems in America was that she was fighting, in effect, as an incumbent on a record where the American economy has recently done incredibly well, and one of the best performing, if not the best performing, of the major countries of the world. But the hangover from the inflation of the last 2 or 3 years before this year allowed Donald Trump to say, "Do you feel better now?" And people said no. And there's a lot of polling evidence that people don't feel better off. They feel the country's going in the wrong direction. So there are dangers. But the question I think one got to ask is, do you simply carry on as now with a policy that you know is going to hold Britain back? Or do you start the process with a degree of openness and candour, which has a chance of getting Britain on the right trajectory? Now, does that guarantee success for the next election? Of course it doesn't. However, because, pretty well the whole of the business community, all economists, there is it's something closer to a consensus on an economic controversy, bigger than I've ever seen before. I think Labour can make that case, and I think it will actually put the Conservatives in a difficult position, because I think because the Conservatives simply don't have a growth strategy. So if it says, with the business community and economists saying this is necessary, and the Tories saying we're against this, well, that's actually, I think, not a bad political place for Labour to be in. So I'm not saying this is easy, this is quick, this is simple, this is guaranteed. It's none of those things, but it's the best chance we have. And if you start making the case now, I think you can make it work politically before the next election, even if the economic fruits are not coming till after the next election.
Well, Peter, you know that I, of all people, agree wholeheartedly
Yeah.
with that sentiment. And I think where some of my concerns have been has been that Labour clearly do want to reset the relationship,
Mm.
but that they would just sort of like to quietly get on with it. They're worried about drawing too much attention to it. One example being the Product Regulation and Metrology Bill, which sounds like this terribly boring, dull bill, quite purposefully, that has started in the House of Lords, not in the Commons, which is all about domestically aligning with EU standards to give business the certainty and to signal to Europe that alignment is the direction of travel that this government wants to head into. But my concern is that if you quietly get on with it, it makes it much more difficult to shout about the fruits of your labour when they do come to ripening, which may, as you point
Mm.
out, be after the next election. So I think they need to be a bit bolder now about saying, we are fixing this. Here's how we're doing it.
Mm.
We're not going to feel any benefit from it in the short term because we're not the party of an instant sugar rush
Mm.
that leaves you crashing 2 minutes later. We're about slow and steady growth, and that's going to come. So I do have that concern. And sticking with America, if Trump's tariffs do come into force and that the UK might be looking at 20% tariffs on exports to the USA, could that be the catalyst Labour needs or the political cover it needs to at least seek out a customs arrangement with the EU, such as Turkey has? Or is ECJ oversight forever going to hang over their heads like some kind of Farage sword of Damocles?
Let me take these issues in sequence. So to unbundle, I agree entirely with what you say. I think the problem with the softly approach, you mentioned product regulations, you could look with veterinary issues, you may in the end get to some agreement on students coming to Britain. I think there are two problems with that. The first is that individually they won't make a big difference. If our GDP is 4 to 5% lower than it would have been had we stayed in the EU, these things will claw back only a small fraction of that 4 to 5% lost from the economy. And the second point is that you are going to get along the way, you're going to get Nigel Farage taking any one of these issues and saying, look, the point of Brexit was that we diverge from the EU. We set our own rules, and it's through setting our own rules we'll get the benefits of Brexit. So I'm not even sure that softly will stay softly.
And not forgetting the fact that you might want to keep it on the down low, government, but the EU won't. Famously, they will trumpet from the
That's right.
rooftops any
Yeah.
brilliant, new deal that the two parties sign with each other, big or small.
Actually, there is a case for candour. We've not had candour on this sector and many other things. There's a lot of going on in the government, and we're talking about only one aspect of it, where they're taking decisions behind closed doors. Look at what happened with farmers, where even the department responsible for farming didn't know until the night before what was going to happen on inheritance tax on what it meant for farmers, right? So I think they're missing a trick by not coming out boldly and saying, look, it is nonsense for us to diverge EU standards. We're much better being part of this larger bloc. But they're scared of saying that because people say, okay, well, why not join the customs union and the single market? So I think they're in a complete presentational mess over this. Now, as for your point about American tariffs, this is, I was going to say fascinating, as if it's some sort of remote
But
social
no, it's
experiment,
happening to us.
but it's bloody serious, because I do think that there's a very, very high chance that in the next few months Britain will face a choice, which is to ignore the EU and seek a bilateral deal with America, ignoring the EU, or to work with the EU on getting a continent-wide agreement with Trump. In other words, I think Britain may have to choose whether it puts its commercial relationship with America ahead of its relationship with Europe. My great fear is they will choose America, they will seek a bilateral deal. It won't work, as it didn't happen when Trump was president last time. We will, a year or 18 months or 2 years down the track, 3 years, somewhere down the track, they will grovel to Brussels and say, actually, look, we really need to come back and work with Europe. By which time, I think they'll have lost the opportunity, because the European Union will have merrily gone on its way in trying to work out its relationship with America. And as so often in the last 80 years the last 80 years of our relationship with Europe has been to resist and then join the party when it's too late or getting too late, and when the rules have already been decided. So I now speak not as a pollster, but as a citizen worried about my country. It seems to be obvious that Britain has to work with the EU, and the EU has to work with Britain. It's in their interest too. It's a common front on dealing with the American Trump tariff threat. I fear they won't, and I fear they'll live to regret it.
Indeed, and I think that concern will be shared by many of our listeners. I'm going to bring us back over the Atlantic to the UK, if I may, while I've got you for the last few minutes of our show. There have been a couple of Westminster voting intention polls out since I think you published your latest Substack, and I'm sure you'll be delving into them in future articles. But they've put the Conservatives a bit ahead of Labour. And I wondered how typical that is in the first 6 months following a general election for the country to move against a new government.
Oh, pretty well every government has a honeymoon period. And what is different from one election to another is some are very short and some are longer. The Tony Blair honeymoon in 1997 lasted 3 to 4 years, or 3 years, and then they had a dip, and then they came back in 21. That was an incredibly long honeymoon. Margaret Thatcher, it was much shorter. Within a few months, the polls were moving against Thatcher and against the Conservatives, and they started losing by-elections and so on. But I think what is different is that the baseline is a government that came to power with only just under 35% of the Britain-wide vote, 34% if you take the UK and include Northern Ireland. It's the lowest share of any majority government has ever had. So when it loses just a few percentage points, as it has done in recent polls, and it dips below 30%, is at the sort of level which past governments have not reached for 2 or 3 years. And I think we're living in a very peculiar time, because the Conservatives, you say, recent polls have put them neck and neck, a bit ahead, a bit behind. But we're talking about both parties around 28 to 30%. In other words, neither of the main parties is particularly popular. So I'm simply making the analytical point that just as the voting was actually very fragmented, because Reform picked up 4 million votes, the Lib Dem picked up fewer votes but lots in their target seats, the Green vote doubled, and so on. We're in a much stranger world, where we've got a first past the post voting system, and you and I, Naomi, I don't think see quite eye to eye on what we'd ideally like, but nevertheless the fact remains that you have a voting system which helps.
Really designed for a two-party system, and we now have a very fragmented
Yeah.
party setup.
But we clearly have a voting system. Yeah, the fact that Reform got more than 4 million votes and has 5 MPs, and the Liberal Democrats got 3.5 million votes, fewer votes, and have 72 MPs. Well, it's peculiar.
Indeed,
But it also means that it becomes much harder to work out where politics is going to go in the future, because the relationship of votes to seats is getting really weird. The Lib Dems historically, and quite reasonably, have said that we keep on getting all these votes, but we don't get the seats to match. This time, the Lib
and the
Dems got
Greens.
almost exactly the right number of seats if you look at their
Yes, for
overall
the first
national
time
vote.
ever, first past the post delivered for the Lib Dems.
It's a very, very strange world. And I could paint you a picture where Labour disintegrates the next election. I can paint you a picture where Labour remains comfortably in power with even fewer votes than it got this time. I can paint you a picture of the Tories becoming the largest party. I can paint you a picture of the Tories virtually disappearing. We're in a much weirder and more volatile a state of how voters behave and how the behaviour of voters relates to the seats that parties win.
But you'd posit that if they want to do something popular, being front-footed on the relationship with Europe might help them out a bit. And on that, I want to go for one final question, if I may, Peter, because I feel incredibly privileged to have access unfiltered to your big brain. Farmers, they've dominated the news this week.
Mm.
Labour clearly has got a big job on its hand to win them over. Do we know what rural communities want from the relationship with Europe? And because listeners will write in about it, because they always do, what would you say to those in our pro European circles who say, oh, well, it's farmers' own fault they voted for Brexit, who cares?
The difficulty is first defining what you mean by a rural voter. How small does a community, does a village have to be for it to be considered genuinely rural? Is a town of 40 or 50,000 people in a rural county, do the people who live in that town count as rural voters or not? And there's no right or wrong answer. The one thing we're reasonably clear about is that farmers were a bit more in favour of Brexit than non-farmers. The difference wasn't that huge. It's simply not right to say farmers were all eager for Brexit. It is clear that some farmers thought they would be better off, and because of the change from the European to a national subsidy regime, have lost out. There were pro-Brexit farmers who thought they'd be better off and have turned out to be worse off with Brexit. But the absolute numbers of farmers in Britain is actually quite small. The number of people or people who work for farmers. This is actually, in terms of employment, a small part of our economy. And as for the inheritance tax issue, this is a classic example of where people in the Treasury looked at some statistics and say, oh, well, it only affects a few hundred people, what the hell, and didn't understand the dynamics. One of the things I find interesting about this is that there are farmers, and we've seen them all on television every day for the last week or two, who are saying, my farm is worth £5 million or £10 million. There'll be all this inheritance tax to pay, but we only get a 1% return on the
Mm.
value, and therefore we can't afford it. And then two questions strike me. One is, well, if you inherit a £10 million farm, you can always sell it, pay the inheritance tax, and you're still a millionaire, right? Uh, and the second thing, and I may be provoking some of your listeners to beyond redemption, but if they can get 5 or 10 million for their farm, if that's what it is worth, why does anybody buy it if they can only get a 1% return, right? So what occurs to me is that I can think of three possible reasons, and all may apply to some extent. One is because until now, the inheritance tax issue has meant that people buy it even if they don't get a return because it's a shelter for their money. Well, if that's the case, under the new arrangement, I've got good news for farmers. The value of their farms will fall and they won't have to pay inheritance tax, right? The second is that people buying it could actually be more efficient farmers, get a higher return growing food. Well, that would be good news for Britain. And the third is they could get a return by selling the land to build houses. Well, at the moment, we've got a big housing shortage, so I'm not sure that's a terribly bad thing either. So I'm simply mystified by the economics behind the argument of people saying that we'll have all this inheritance tax to pay and the fund doesn't make us any money. There's something not quite right about those statements.
Peter, your words of wisdom will ring in our ears for a long time. Thank you so much for joining us. Please do come back onto Quiet Riot in the future. And it's been our real pleasure to have you today.
I've loved it, Naomi. Good luck. Thank you.
Listeners, I hope you enjoyed Peter's first ever Poll the Other One. Do make sure that you subscribe to his Substack. We'll leave a link in the show notes below. We'll tag him on social media as and when we push this episode out. I thought it was really refreshing to hear a pollster kind of gloves off, making the case for unequivocally for why the new government ought to be not only pursuing a much closer trading relationship with Europe, but being quite bold in their comms that they are doing so. That is quite unusual, particularly for people in his industry who tend to tread quite a tight rope when it comes to analysing the results and what they actually mean for a party's political strategy, rather than sort of being very, very neutral and presenting it. So I really enjoyed talking to him. We've disagreed in the past about quite a few things, so it was really refreshing to come together today and dig into the detail of the data that he'd crunched based on the last election. If you want to hear more from him, let us know. We'll make sure to get him back on the show. We'll have other pollsters too. And of course, Luke Trill, who runs More in Common, who now do a huge amount of polling, is very much our resident and regular pollster. But if you want us to get a few others in, do let me know. As you know, very much my geeky pastime favourite subject. As ever, please like, subscribe, review, follow us on socials, support us on ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod if you can. Leave us some feedback, and we'll see you again very soon. Thanks for listening. Bye. Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Andreou, and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Singita. Artwork by Simona Canellu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with SandStone Global.